Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part 3 of the digestive system. So at the end of part 2, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the 4 different layers of the gastrointestinal tract. We had the mucosa, we had the submucosa, we had the muscularis, and then the outermost layer was the adventitia or serosa. Now, in this third and larger section on the digestive system, we'll be taking a look at the specifics of the various regions of the GI tract and looking at the specific differences in the structures in those various regions. So we'll start superficially up in, not superficially, superiorly at the esophagus. So if you remember, your esophagus was your food pipe leading from your larynx down into your stomach. So it is a muscular tube for the movement of food. So the esophagus is going to connect to your larynx and to your stomach, which means it must pass through the diaphragm. So there is a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus through which the esophagus passes. It's about 25 centimeters long, and only about the last 2 centimeters is going to go inferiorly past the diaphragm before it actually connects to the stomach. So the esophagus has 2 sphincters, or just little muscular valves that allow it to close. You have the superior esophageal sphincter, which is going to be found at the union between the pharynx and the esophagus. And the main purpose of the superior esophageal sphincter is to avoid ingesting air, right? You don't want to be swallowing large amounts of air while you're eating your food. If this structure fails to do its job, you'll end up burping a lot. So there you go. The inferior esophageal sphincter at the bottom end of the esophagus, where the esophagus meets the stomach, right? Its main purpose is to prevent the backflow of material from the stomach into the esophagus, right? So if this thing is not doing its job, your result are going to be heartburn, which has nothing to do with your heart. It has to do with stomach acid starting to climb up into your esophagus, which is going to be painful. Okay, so this is a transverse section through the esophagus. Notice that the whole thing is kind of crumpled down, right? Your trachea had to be propped open because you always have to have air passing through that, or almost always, right? Your esophagus can kind of crumple down, right? Because if you're not actually swallowing anything, it doesn't necessarily have to be open. But it's got this kind of crazy sort of star shape because the whole thing can expand and then contract back down. Just like our standard model of the GI tract, we're going to have our basic layers. You're going to have the mucosa. Superficial to that, you're going to have the submucosa. And then you're going to have the muscularis. Right? That's pretty easy to see because of all those layers of smooth muscle. And then you're going to have adventitia. So remember, the vast majority of your esophagus is in your thoracic cavity. There's no peritoneum there, right? So you're not going to have a serosa, you're going to have an adventitia. Right, so here we can see superior esophageal sphincter, the esophagus, inferior esophageal sphincter after it passes through the diaphragm. If you remember from our lecture on the respiratory system, any place you're going to have food passing through, you're going to be non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, right? And that's true for the oral cavity, for the oral pharynx, the laryngeal pharynx, and for the esophagus, all the way until you get to the stomach, where we're going to get a change, but we'll talk about that once we get to the stomach. But you can see the epithelium is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Then we're going to have our lamina propria. Then we'll have the muscularis mucosae, a thin layer of smooth muscle. Remember, this is not the muscularis, which is way out here. This picture down here is all inside this little black box here. So this kind of purpley stuff here, this is the muscularis mucosae, right? That is the muscularis. Remember, try to keep those kind of clear. Let's talk about stomach. So the stomach is in the upper left quadrant of your abdomen. Here is where we will continue the mechanical and chemical digestion of food. Right? We chewed in the mouth, we did mechanical digestion. We also did chemical digestion in the mouth through things like amylase and lipase in saliva. In the stomach, we're going to be doing chemical digestion with hydrochloric acid and mechanical digestion because the stomach is a very strong muscular organ which will do a good job mixing all this stuff together. Now, food, a bolus that has been swallowed and enters your stomach, it gets a name change. It's called chyme. Do not confuse chyle with chyme. Chyle is the fluid in your lacteals carrying absorbed dietary fats, right? That was something in the lymphatic system. Chyme is what is inside your stomach, right? So you don't really call it food or a bolus, you call it chyme. Okay, so here is the stomach. We have 4 basic regions. We have fundus, which is this big dome-like structure. We have the cardia, which is the immediate entry point of the stomach. We have the body of the stomach, which makes up the main bulk of the organ. And then down here at the terminal end, we have the pylorus. So the way you get into the stomach is through that inferior esophageal sphincter. So if you swallow some food, it goes down the esophagus, passes through the inferior esophageal sphincter, enters the cardia of the stomach. Right, from the cardia to the fundus to the body to the pylorus. If you want to get out of the stomach, you go through the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter opens into the small intestines. The first section of the small intestine is called the duodenum or duodenum. So one important thing to point out is the stomach has not 2, but 3 layers of muscle. So its muscularis is extra thick because, as you may well know, your stomach is a very muscular organ, right? You can feel it kind of doing its thing, either when you're hungry or when you've already eaten, and it needs to mix up all that food. So there are 2 exceptions. So when I talked about general structure of the gastrointestinal tract, I said the muscularis has an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. That's true throughout the whole GI tract, except for 2 places. The first one is here in the stomach, where we have 3 layers of smooth muscle. We have an inner oblique layer, that's the extra layer here on the muscle. Then we have a middle circular layer of smooth muscle, followed by a longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. So stomach gets a 3rd layer. The other place where we have something weird going on with layers of smooth muscle is in the colon, but we'll deal with that later. Just remember, everywhere else, 2 layers in the muscularis. In the stomach, we have 3, and there's something funny going on with the colon. So when we were talking about the various mesenteries, I talked about the greater omentum and the lesser omentum being connected to the greater and lesser curvatures of the stomach. Well, here we see them, right? The small curve is the lesser curvature of the stomach, right? Connecting to the lesser omentum. What does that connect to? Connects up to the liver. Greater omentum connects to the greater curvature, and that just drapes down over the various other abdominal organs. Let's see. If you look at the inside of the stomach, you're going to find lots of ridges and grooves, either called gastric folds, or another name for it are called rugae. I do believe that's everything in this picture right here. If we look on the right-hand side, we see the histology of the stomach. Specifically, we're looking at the transition between the esophagus and the stomach. And you can see this is a remarkable bright line transition. This is esophagus. This is stomach. And you notice it's not kind of a slow change. It's a very bright line, very bright distinction. In the esophagus, you have non-keratinized stratified squamous. Over here in the stomach, you have simple columnar epithelium. You might think for a second, okay, but we understand that we need non-keratinized stratified squamous in the esophagus to protect versus abrasion, right? You eat leaves or something like that, they're gonna have little scratchy bits. You need to be able to protect the inside of your mouth and inside your esophagus. You would think you also need protection in your stomach, right? Because it's filled with basically hydrochloric acid. It's filled a little bit like battery acid. This is nasty stuff. Don't we need protection there? You do need protection, but you need a different kind of protection. Instead of a thick layer of cells, you're going to have a layer of mucus, right? So it's actually the mucus that's on top of this simple columnar epithelium that is going to protect you in the stomach. So yes, you do need protection, but you need chemical protection, not mechanical protection. That's why the epithelia tissue will change here quite dramatically. So this is just a cadaver that has been opened up. The stomach has been cut open, and you can see those rugae or those gastric folds, because when empty, the stomach shrivels up. And you eat a bunch of food, it's going to swell up, right? And so you need those folds to allow for that stretching and distension. So we'll just go through the various terms that I pointed out in the slide, but just to remind you, 4 regions of the stomach: cardia, fundus, body, and pylorus. We had a superior and inferior border called the greater and inferior curvature of the stomach. Folds inside are called rugae, or gastric folds. Now, if we look at the histology of the stomach, we're going to see structures called gastric pits. And gastric pits, at the bottom of the gastric pits, we're going to have things called gastric glands. So here's the gastric pit. If you keep going down the gastric pit, you get into the gastric glands. Notice that we have our 4 basic layers of the GI tract: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, serosa. Remember, the stomach is interperitoneal, so it will have a serosa and not an adventitia. So we're going to have a epithelium, this time simple columnar epithelium, because we need protection from stomach acid. We will have a lamina propria, which will have blood vessels and lymphatics. We still have the muscularis mucosae, which serves as a boundary line between the mucosa and the submucosa beneath it. Right. Exterior to the submucosa, we have the muscularis. Remember, in the stomach, 3 layers of smooth muscle: inner oblique, middle circular, and outer longitudinal. So I should be able to give you a model or a picture of the stomach and have of this histology and have it totally unlabeled. And I'll ask you, what organ is this? And you should be able to tell me, because you can see 1, 2, 3 layers of smooth muscle. Only organ that has that is the stomach. Okay, so here is the histology of the stomach. You can see the gastric pits. Down here are the gastric glands. They look quite different from each other. If we look at the cartoon model over here, we can see the different types of cells. So up at the top, we have surface mucus cells, followed by mucus neck cells when you get further down, right? Down at the bottom, you're going to get parietal cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells. So we'll be able, let's take a look at what each of these cells do on the next slide. So I do want you to know these types of cells, and I do want you to know what they do. So surface mucus cells, these guys here that are on the surface, they're going to produce an alkaline mucus. So alkaline means basic, so it's the opposite of acidic. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you have pH 2.2, which is very acidic acid floating around inside the stomach, you do not want that coming into contact with your epithelial tissue, because it's one single layer of cells. They'll get instantly dissolved. And then you'll end up with an ulcer, and then you'll start bleeding, and that's bad, right? So we need to protect that delicate tissue using mucus that has the opposite pH, or it has a basic pH compared to the stomach acid. So surface mucus cells make alkaline or basic mucus to protect us from stomach acid. Okay, that makes sense. Now, mucus neck cells make an acidic mucus. Let's go back. So way down here, a little bit deeper down, you're going to have mucus neck cells are making an acid kind of mucus. Now, at first glance, you're like, what the hell? We have 2 kinds of cells, one making basic mucus, one making acid mucus. What gives? Well, here it is. Surface mucus cells make basic mucus to protect the wall of the stomach. This stuff is thick and gloppy, and it stays stuck to the walls of the stomach to protect the stomach. Mucus neck cells, this acidic mucus is very liquidy. So what this does, this actually leaves the gastric glands and the gastric pits and actually mixes with the food inside the stomach, mixes with the chyme inside the stomach. So this acid mucus mixes with the food to be digested, and will help actually digest the food and help the food move further along through the digestive tract. So the purpose of this stuff is to protect the stomach from digesting itself. The purpose of this stuff is to help you actually break down your food and help transport that food through the body. So that's what's going on with that. Now, parietal cells, the job of the parietal cells are to produce hydrochloric acid. How they do that, I will save that for physiology, but that's what they're going to do. Chief cells are going to produce pepsinogen and lipases. So lipases, we mentioned, are necessary for breaking down fats. We saw those in saliva. Pepsinogen is a precursor for something called pepsin. And pepsin stands for peptide. Peptide are another name for proteins. So pepsinogen is going to turn into pepsin, and pepsin breaks down proteins. So carbohydrates and fats their chemical breakdown starts in the mouth because of saliva and continues, and the breakdown of fats continues in the stomach because of lipases. Protein will be broken down because of stomach acid and because of the action of pepsin, but that really happens more in the small intestine, but I will save that for physiology. Chief cells are going to produce a compound that will eventually break down proteins and produce lipases to break down fats. The last type of cell here are the enteroendocrine cells. They secrete a hormone called gastrin. What gastrin does is tell the parietal cells, make more HCl. Okay, that's it for the stomach. Let's move on to the small intestine. So the small intestine really does the majority of the chemical breakdown of your food. It's not so much the stomach. Stomach acid is important. Lipases are important. But the vast majority of chemical breakdown is going to happen in the small intestine. So finishes the chemical digestion process, right? Typically, Kyle needs to spend about 12 hours in the small intestine for complete chemical breakdown and absorption. It's believed that the small intestine is about 6 meters long. However, it's really not possible to measure, right? In a cadaver or a dead person, it's 6 meters or 20 feet. In a live person, it's probably much shorter than that because there's a certain amount of muscle tone in the muscularis, right? So it's going to shorten up the intestines. The problem is when you die, right, that's all going to relax and then the intestines are going to stretch out, right? So it's kind of hard to tell somebody, hey, I want to cut you open and like cut away all your mesentery so I can take a ruler and measure exactly how long a human small intestine is. So you don't really know, or let's hope we don't know, because that would be a really horrific experiment. But that's why we give this about 20 feet long in a cadaver. Okay, 3 basic regions of the small intestine. The first part connecting to the stomach is called the duodenum. This then transitions into the jejunum, and then the final portion is called the ileum, and the ileum is going to connect with the large intestine. So in this image, the stomach has been removed. You can't see it. That's the liver. That's the pancreas. They play an important role. They're partners with the duodenum. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So the stomach drains into this C-shaped, right, letter C right there, the C-shaped organ called the duodenum. The duodenum ends when it is going to go behind the colon here. This is the duodenal jejunal flexure. Duodenal jejunal flexure marks the change from the duodenum to the jejunum. About halfway through your small intestines, the jejunum is going to transition to the ileum. I'm not going to ask you to make that designation. Then the ileum is going to connect to the large intestine via the ileocecal valve. Ileo for ileum. And this first section of the large intestine is called cecum. That's why we get the ileocecal valve. It's just another sphincter to control the flow of material from the small intestine into the large intestine. Okay, so let's just go through these parts, break it down. Duodenum is that C-shaped organ. It's in basically drains the stomach and connects to the rest of the small intestine, right? It connects to the jejunum at the duodenal jejunal flexure. Inside the duodenum, we have a structure called the major duodenal papilla. So we'll take a closer look at this when we go look at accessory organs at the very end of this section. But the major duodenal papilla, remember papilla just means finger-like projection. You're going to see this little finger-like thing sticking into the duodenum. And through this finger-like thing, pancreatic juice is going to flow into the duodenum. Also, bile is going to flow into the duodenum. So pancreatic juice is going to contain lots of digestive enzymes, which are actually going to break down the vast majority of our food. Bile, bile's purpose is to serve as an emulsifier, which is required for breaking down fats. So it's going to break fats into teeny tiny little droplets so our digestive enzymes can do their job and break them down. Okay. Next section of the small intestine is the jejunum. Right here, you're going to have the vast majority of chemical digestion and even nutrient absorption is going to take place. Right, the ileum, the last stage. Here, when it meets with the large intestine, we find that ileocecal valve. So we're going to look at the histology of the small intestine. Here, the mucosa is going to be highly folded into structures called circular folds. On those circular folds, you're going to have finger-like projections called villi. And on the villi, you're going to find another simple columnar epithelium. And on those epithelial cells, you will find microvilli. So what you're seeing here are many, many structures, many, many folds. And the purpose of this is to vastly increase surface area. So we need a very large surface area in the small intestines because all that digested food has to be brought across the epithelium and absorbed into the body, right? That is a lot of material that has to pass through that thin structure. So we need that surface area as wide as possible to allow for that. Let's go to the picture. It should be a little bit more clear. So here is the small intestine suspended by the mesentery proper. So with your eye, you can see a macroscopic structure. You're going to see all these ridges and folds, right? Those are the circular folds that I'm talking about. Anybody here ever have chitlins or intestines or something like that? You can see these sort of convolutions. Though oftentimes they actually will like remove this layer if you buy them to eat them. But anyway, sorry, I grew up in the South with this is the thing. Anyway, let me get back to the topic. Circular folds, macroscopic structures you can see with the unaided eye, right? So if you take a blow up of this little section right here, big circular folds that you can definitely see. Coming off those circular folds, you see finger-like projections. These finger-like projections, those are the villi, right? Villi are quite small. You're not going to be able to see them with the unaided eye. If you take a blow up of one villi, this is one villus, you can see it has a simple columnar epithelium, right, with goblet cells. On that epithelium, the apical surface of these cells are going to have microvilli. So circular folds plus villi plus microvilli drastically increase the surface area of the small intestine to allow for the absorption of nutrients into our blood supply and into the lacteals, right? So carbohydrates, protein, all that good stuff, that's going to go inside your circulatory system. Dietary fats are going to be absorbed into your lacteals, right? And all that stuff can then be brought into the body. So I mentioned before, Peyer's patches, lymphatic nodules. Well, there one is right there down in the lamina propria. Epithelium, lamina propria, muscularis mucosae. So this right there is the mucosa of the small intestines. Down here, submucosa. We're also going to have a layer of mucus to help protect our various epithelial tissue from all those digestive enzymes that you're going to have floating around in your small intestine. So this is just a slide. You can see one of these is one individual villus. You can see the simple columnar epithelium with the various goblet cells producing the mucus to help keep these cells safe. You take a blow up of one surface of one or two epithelial cells. Now you can see the microvilli, right? Teeny tiny microvilli that you're going to need an electron microscope to see clearly. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the large intestine. So this forms a three-sided perimeter around our abdominal cavity. It is considerably larger in diameter than the small intestine, which is why it's called the large intestine. The main job of the large intestine or the colon is water reclamation, right? To absorb water. So anyone who's ever vomited and is thrown up, right, you're going to have liquidy stuff inside your stomach. It's also going to be liquidy stuff inside your small intestines, right? In order to prevent dehydration, as much of that water as possible needs to be reabsorbed into the body, and that's the main function of the large intestine, right? Also, the large intestines provide a convenient storage place for fecal matter, for poop. So it's the place to store it conveniently until you have a time and place where you can, remove it from the body. So I know this is sort of unpleasant conversation, but this is an anatomy class, and hey, we're going to have to talk poop. So one thing I will point out here to help kind of sober the conversation is anyone who has ever had any issues with this part of their body, with lack of function or needing something like a colostomy, you have no idea how important this is to quality of life until you have it taken away from you. So I'll just kind of put that out there. You should be very appreciative for these structures because they do a lot to make our lives convenient and pleasant. So I'll just leave it at that. Okay, here we have the large intestine. So here we have the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, that ends in the ileocecal valve, which controls the flow of material into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestines, called like a blind sac, because material can go this direction, but it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to stop. So this whole little pocket area is called the cecum. Hanging off the cecum is your vermiform appendix. This is your appendix. Anyone who's ever had appendicitis, that thing got real angry and inflamed, and usually they go and cut it out. So what's the deal with the appendix? Different theories. The leading one that I have read about indicates the appendix is a vestigial or leftover, evolutionary speaking, a leftover portion of our intestinal tract that was specifically used to house bacteria that would help break down plant matter. So our early ancestors were much more vegetarian than earlier humans were, and so you need a much longer digestive tract in order to process that very low value material. I don't want to get too far into it. You don't get a whole lot of nutrition from plants. You just think about it. Think of any animal that eats a huge amount of plant material. What do they have? They all have really big bellies. Look at a cow. Look at a rhino. Look at an elephant, right? They need a lot of intestines because there's not a whole lot of nutritional value in what they eat. All right, now think of a tiger or a leopard or a jaguar, right? They have these very thin bellies, right? It's very curved. If you look at the digestive tract of carnivores, it's real short because they're eating extremely high, nutrient food, super high levels of protein, high levels of fat, right? So their intestinal tract can be shorter. So this is not a comparative anatomy class, but I just wanted you to know, what's this appendix thing all about? It's an evolutionary leftover back when we used to need longer, more complicated intestines for the breakdown of plants. Nowadays, it can be susceptible to infection and can really ruin your day. Okay, let's get back on topic. So the cecum opens to the, ascending colon. So going up, the ascending colon then, boink, bumps into, right? It's going to bump into, and it's going to make a little turn. It's going to turn into the right colic flexure. So it's going to bump into your liver. Sometimes it's called the hepatic flexure or right colic flexure. There, it's going to go transverse across your abdomen, and then boink, it's going to bump into your spleen, where you're going to have the splenic flexure, also called left colic flexure. And from there, it's going to travel inferiorly. So this will become your descending colon. So when it hits your iliac bone, it's then going to make this little S shape so it can get right to the middle of your pelvic floor and exit your body wall, right? So where it makes a little S-shaped curve is called sigmoidal colon. After the sigmoidal colon, you're going to have the area called the rectum. Now, a lot of people think the little hole at their back end where the poop comes out, that's your rectum. Not anatomy. This space here is the rectum. The rectum connects the sigmoid colon with the anal canal. So the anus is the hole that leads out of your body. The rectum is the space inside or superior to the anal canal. So just some unfortunate particulars that we need to talk about. So we have two mesenteries that support the large intestine. We have the transverse mesocolon, supporting the transverse portion of the colon, and the sigmoidal mesocolon. This will support and stabilize the sigmoidal colon. So the colon gets a little bit complicated. The ascending colon is retroperitoneal. The transverse colon is intraperitoneal. The descending colon is retroperitoneal. The sigmoidal colon is intraperitoneal, and the rectum is retroperitoneal. So the short answer to this is they alternate. Retro, inter, retro, inter, retro, right? They alternate depending on the various spaces. Do you need to know that? Yeah, you need to know where the mesenteries are. So, serosa or adventitia, adventitia, serosa, adventitia, serosa, adventitia. Okay, other structures here. You're going to see this little stripe. That little stripe here is called the tinea coli. The tinea coli translates to the worm of the colon. We'll come back to that in a second. These little sac-like structures, which look like little sausage links, these are called haustra. So one haustra, another haustra, another haustra. These little blobs of what look like fat hanging off are called omental appendices. I do believe we've talked, oh, okay, let's talk anal canal, shall we? So here we can see the end of the rectum. Inside the rectum, you're going to have 3 rectal valves, 1, 2, and the third one is not shown. We got to talk about it. The purpose of the rectal valve is to allow gas to pass, but retain solid or liquid matter. So if you wish to pass gas, but not expel fecal matter, that's the job of the rectal valves. These structures here are called anal columns and anal sinuses. So these little ridges of muscle, those are called anal columns. The space in between are called anal sinuses. This is how the anus is able to open up and close down, right? Inside the anal sinuses, you will find a large number of mucosal glands because you need lots of mucus in this area in order to avoid damage through defecation. Here is the wall of the colon. Colon is part of your gastrointestinal tract, which means its muscle is made up of smooth muscle. Right? Do you choose when you poop? Hopefully, right? Which means we have to have skeletal muscle involved somewhere. So see this external anal sphincter? That's going to be skeletal muscle. That's how you're going to be able to exercise conscious control of when you actually go to the bathroom. Okay. One other little sort of unpleasant factoid to point out here in the anal canal, you see this large concentration of veins. Honestly, I don't know why there's a very large concentration of veins there, but there are. And anyone who's ever had to deal with hemorrhoids, this is usually where those structures are coming from. So hemorrhoids are when these veins are put under a great deal of pressure, the veins, the valves fail and the veins fill up with blood, and then they protrude from the anal canal, and they're very unpleasant. The way you commonly get these structures, if you have excessive pressure in your abdominal cavity, right? There can be many ways of getting too much pressure in your abdominal cavity. The most common ones are spending too long going to the bathroom or bearing down too hard when you go to the bathroom, or being pregnant, right? Because if you have a fetus, especially a 9-month fetus, sitting on top of the structure, pushing down on it, that's going to add a whole bunch of extra pressure. So that's what's going on with that. Okay, moving on, right? Regions of the large intestine: cecum, to the ascending colon, to the transverse colon, to the descending colon, to the sigmoidal colon, to the rectum, and then to the anal canal. One thing I want to remind you, one thing to think about, you can memorize this stuff, but if you think about it, it makes your life easier. What's the job of the large intestine? Water reabsorption. If you want to transport large amounts of stuff, do you want many, many, many layers of cells? Probably not, right? Because that's going to make it really hard to reabsorb the water. So you will find simple columnar in the large intestine. You will also find simple columnar in the rectum. However, what's the job of the anal canal, right? Anal canal is how you get out of the body. Do you have abrasion in the anal canal? Yeah, you certainly can. You want to have some mechanical protection there. So what are you going to have to protect this tissue? You're going to have non-keratinized stratified squamous. So you should be aware of the various types of epithelial tissue from one end of your gastrointestinal tract to the other. Right? Any place you're going to have mechanical abrasion: oral cavity, oral pharynx, laryngopharynx, esophagus, you're going to have non-keratinized stratified squamous. That includes the anal canal. Once you get into the stomach, you need protection from chemicals. So you need special mucus, so you're going to go simple columnar. So from the stomach, through the small intestine, through the large intestine, through the rectum, you're going to have simple columnar. And again, as the material exits the body, just as it entered the body, we need protection from abrasion. So we're going to need non-keratinized stratified squamous. Right, so cecum, that's just the first part, right? This is the blind sac. The ileocecal valve controls the flow of material from the small intestine into the large intestine. The ascending colon is going to travel superiorly until it basically just bumps into the liver and then has to take a turn. So that's called the hepatic flexure or the right colic flexure. Run across the transverse colon. Remember, the transverse colon is interperitoneal, right? It is supported by the transverse mesocolon. Then boink, it hits the spleen and needs to travel inferiorly. So that becomes the descending colon until boink, it hits your ilium bone. And then it's going to turn, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The descending colon, right, after the splenic flexure, left colic flexure, right? And this will end when it hits the ilium and turns, which is the ilium bone, and then turn into your sigmoidal colon. Sigmoid stands for S because it makes a little S-shaped curve, right? The sigmoidal colon is supported by your sigmoidal mesocolon, just another mesentery, right? And then it will connect to the rectum, right? The rectum, you're going to have 3 folds of muscle, the rectal valves, which control liquid and solid material, but allow for the passage of gas. The rectum terminates at the anal canal, and the anal canal leads out into the wide world. Anal canal, the last few centimeters of the large intestine, right? It needs to pass through the floor, the muscles of the pelvic floor, anal columns and sinuses. Remember, these are the sort of grooves around the anus that allow for this structure to open and close. And the internal, external sphincters are to be able to control your bowel movement. Okay, so that's sort of the gross anatomy. Let's talk about the histology. So here we have our simple columnar epithelium of the large intestine. Notice that we have in our mucosa, we have epithelium, we have lamina propria, and then we have the muscularis mucosae. Right? That is our boundary. Right? Deep to that, we're going to have the submucosa shown here, and then we're going to have the muscularis. And outside of the muscularis, we're going to have, is it adventitia or is it serosa? Well, it depends, right? If you're ascending, descending rectum, Since you're retroperitoneal, you have an adventitia. If you are transverse or sigmoidal, you are covered by the visceral layer of the peritoneum, so you have a serosa. So just that same old thing that we talked about it, just looking at it from a slightly different point of view. Now, there's something weird going on here with the muscularis. Do you remember when we were looking at the stomach, I said that your GI tract, there are two layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis, intercircular, outer longitudinal. And I said there were two exceptions to that. One was in the stomach where you have three layers, inner oblique, middle circular, outer longitudinal, and the other one was in the large intestine. Well, here it is. This is weird. So, the clearest, the most direct way of saying this is you are going to have a circular layer and you are going to have a longitudinal layer. The circular layer goes all the way around the wall of the large intestine. That's this one here. So the circular layer of smooth muscle, the innermost layer of smooth muscle in the muscularis goes all the way around the colon. It is continuous. However, the outer longitudinal layer, the one that makes the GI tract shorter, is discontinuous in the colon. It does not go all the way around. It doesn't make a complete jacket. It makes a little cord or a strip, right? So this is the inner layer of smooth muscle. That is the outer layer of smooth muscle. This layer does not go all the way around. It is not continuous. This strip of discontinuous longitudinal muscle is the Taenia coli. So remember this image that I pointed out here, that this stripe right here was called the Taenia coli, right? The worm of the colon. What this physically is, this is that outer layer of smooth muscle. If you go over here, what makes up the wall of the muscularis right here is only that inner circular layer. There is no outer longitudinal layer. The only place you have outer longitudinal smooth muscle is right here on Taenia coli. So if you look at this picture, cut the colon, here is the Taenia coli, a little strip of longitudinal outer smooth muscle, only found in that little strip, the Taenia coli. Everywhere else, you only have the circular smooth muscle layer. So if we look, we're going to have simple columnar epithelium. We're going to have a lot of goblet cells because we need to just move this material along, right? You're going to need mucus to help this material move more efficiently. So what's the job of the large intestine is to reclaim water. So the material is getting thicker and thicker and kind of harder to move. So we need lots of mucus to make sure things don't get stuck or we don't get any damage in this area. Okay, so in words, what I've already hopefully described so a third time, the longitudinal smooth muscle is incomplete. It doesn't go all the way around the colon, right? It forms the bundle called Taenia coli. The little pockets, the little sausages on the colon are called haustra. Hanging off the haustra are what look like little blobs of fat called omental appendices. And that's it. That concludes our tour through the gastrointestinal tract. Next time, we're going to talk about the accessory organs. What do things like the liver and pancreas have to do with digestion? So this was a big one, a lot of heavy lifting. Maybe take a little break and come back next time. Take care.